The day I walked into my mother-in-law's house wearing my hospital badge, she introduced me to her book club friends as my son's wife. She works at the hospital. In administration, I think. I didn't correct her. I had stopped correcting her a long time ago. My husband and I met in our second year at university. He was studying business. I was in pre-med, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and cold Tim Hortons coffee that I'd bought at 7 in the morning and forgotten about until noon. We met at a study group that neither of us was particularly committed to, and somehow between the bad pizza and the borrowed highlighters, we ended up talking until the library closed. He was kind. He still is. That part has never changed. What I didn't understand then, what I couldn't have understood, because I was 20 and in love and too tired to think clearly, was that falling in love with someone means you also inherit everything they came from. Every assumption their family ever made. Every story they told themselves about who you were before they even knew your name. His mother from the very beginning had already decided who I was. I was from a small town in Manitoba. My parents ran a hardware store. I was the first in my family to go to university, which felt like something to be proud of, until I sat across from her at Sunday dinner for the first time and watched her eyes move over me, the way you'd look at a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the room. "How lovely," she said when my husband told her I was studying medicine. "It must be so hard, all those years of school." She said it the way people say things they don't mean. The words landing soft and empty like tissue paper. She lived in a large house in Oakville, Ontario. The kind of house where the dishes matched and the artwork was framed, and there were fresh flowers on the entry table every single week. She'd grown up in that house, inherited it from her own mother, and had spent 30 years making it more and more perfect. She hosted dinners. She sat on 2 charitable boards. She had a specific way of holding her wine glass that made me feel like I was always doing something slightly wrong, even when I was doing nothing at all. She was never cruel. That's what made it so hard to name. She never said anything that you could point to and call an insult. It was always softer than that, more precise. The kind of words that left a mark you couldn't quite show anyone. When I graduated from medical school, she gave me a card that said, "Congratulations on completing your studies," and inside, she had written, "You must be so relieved it's finally over." My husband thought she was being sweet. I held that card for a long time before I put it in the recycling. When I matched into my surgical residency, which was one of the most competitive programs in the country, in Toronto, at a hospital that had turned away hundreds of applicants, she asked me, at the next family dinner, whether I was nervous about all the responsibility. She said she couldn't imagine having people's lives in her hands. She said it to the table, not to me specifically, the way you discuss a concept rather than a person sitting 3 feet away from you. My husband squeezed my hand under the table. He always squeezed my hand. I think he knew, on some level, even if he couldn't fully see it. The years of residency were brutal in the way that anyone who has been through it will understand, and anyone who hasn't can't quite imagine. I was in the hospital more than I was anywhere else. I missed birthdays. I missed anniversaries. I missed a nephew's first steps and a friend's wedding, and one Christmas entirely, because there was a multi-vehicle accident on the 401 on December 24th, and I didn't leave the OR until almost 4 in the morning on the 25th. I stopped going to many of the family dinners. There wasn't time, and if I'm honest, there was also relief in the not going. My mother-in-law would ask my husband how I was doing, and he would tell me later what she said, and I would nod and say something neutral and we would move on. It was easier that way. She had a friend. I'll call her her closest friend, because that's what she was. A woman she'd known for decades, who came to every dinner party, who was in the same book club, who had opinions about everything and delivered them in the same pleasant, unassailable tone. She was a retired teacher. She was warm, the way some people are warm in a way that has edges. She and my mother-in-law would finish each other's sentences and reference things that happened 25 years ago, and laugh at the memory of them. She was also, apparently, devoted to a surgeon at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. I first heard about this surgeon about 4 years into my residency. My mother-in-law mentioned her at a dinner I had actually managed to attend. A Sunday in November, the kind of gray Ontario afternoon, where the light disappears before 5 o'clock, and the whole world feels a bit underwater. Her friend has this doctor, my mother-in-law was explaining to the table. A surgeon, she says she's extraordinary. Really one of the best in the city, apparently. What kind of surgeon? Someone asked. Cardiothoracic, I think. Heart surgery. Very specialized. She said the word specialized the way she said many things, with a kind of reverence that she didn't quite extend to me, even though I was sitting there, 7 years into becoming a surgeon myself. She operated on someone her friend knew, my mother-in-law continued. And it was a case the other doctors had said was inoperable, really serious. And this woman she did it. She apparently does things other surgeons won't attempt. She shook her head slowly, admiringly. I can't imagine what kind of person you have to be. I took a sip of water. My husband was looking at the tablecloth. I was a cardiothoracic surgical fellow by then. Had been for over a year. He knew this. The whole table knew this, or they should have. It had come up before, in the way things come up in families, circling back, never quite landing. But somehow, the surgeon her friend admired existed in a completely different category than me. That surgeon was remarkable. That surgeon was extraordinary. I was just someone who worked at a hospital in a vague capacity that my mother-in-law had never fully registered or retained. I didn't say anything. I helped clear the plates after dinner and drove home in the dark and told my husband I was tired, which was true, and went to bed. But I thought about it. I thought about it more than I should have, probably. I thought about what it meant that she could describe a stranger's professional accomplishments with that particular warmth. That soft, genuine pride you feel when something impresses you. And never once turned that warmth toward me. I used to wonder if it was something I had done. If I had been colder than I realized, more absent than I knew. If there was something in the way I carried myself that she read as arrogance, or indifference, or some quality she found lacking. I went through it the way you go through a problem you can't solve, methodically, testing each possibility and finding it didn't quite fit. Eventually, I stopped trying to find the reason. Some things don't have a reason that would make sense to you. Some people have made up their mind about who you are before you walked in the door, and nothing you do after that. No degree, no achievement, no quiet year after year of just showing up and being decent, will move that needle. You can exhaust yourself trying, or you can stop. I chose, around year 6 of my marriage, to stop. It's not a dramatic choice. It doesn't feel like a resolution when you make it. It just feels like a quiet realignment, like deciding to stop pressing on a bruise and allowing it finally to heal. I finished my fellowship. I was offered a position at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, which I accepted. I was by then specializing in complex valve repair, the kind of cases that came to you when other options had been exhausted, when the anatomy was difficult or the risk was high or the previous surgical attempts had made everything harder. I was not famous. I was not on television. But in the specific world of what I did, people knew my name. My mother-in-law did not know what I did. I'm not sure she knew which hospital I worked at. This didn't bother me anymore. That's what I'm trying to explain. It had bothered me enormously for a long time, and then one day it simply didn't. You don't always know when the shift happens. You just notice, one Sunday, that you drove to a family dinner without bracing yourself on the way there, and that feels like something. My husband's uncle had a heart attack in February. He was 67, a retired contractor from Burlington, a quiet man who liked hockey and made his own pasta and had never, in all the years I'd known him, asked me a single question about medicine. Not because he was unfriendly but because he was shy and didn't want to bother me with it. He was the kind of man who apologized for taking up space. He was transferred to St. Michael's after the initial stabilization at Burlington's hospital. The case was complicated. He had significant coronary artery disease that had gone undetected, and the anatomy made a standard bypass approach high risk. The cardiologist at St. Mike's consulted our department. The case saw his name on the file. I sat with that for a moment. Then I reviewed the imaging, looked at his history, considered the options. I called the cardiologist. We talked through it. I scheduled the surgery for the following week. I didn't tell my husband. Not because I was hiding it, I would have told him if he'd asked, but because he didn't know which cases I was working on at any given time. That's not how our life together worked. He didn't ask me to walk him through my week at the hospital, and I didn't ask him to walk me through his spreadsheets. We had dinner and talked about other things, and that was its own kind of love. I also, I'll admit, wasn't sure how to bring it up in a way that didn't feel complicated. The surgery was long. The anatomy was exactly as difficult as the imaging had suggested, and there was a moment, about 2 hours in, where we hit an unexpected finding that required me to stop, reassess, and take a different approach. I've been in that moment enough times that I know how to be still inside it. You breathe. You think. You do not rush. The surgery went well. Afterward, I went to speak to the family in the waiting room. It was not the first time I had walked into a surgical waiting room and seen people I knew on the other side of a procedure. That happens in a city of this size more often than you'd expect. But I will admit that I took a breath before I pushed open the door. My mother-in-law was there. She was sitting beside her closest friend, the one who admired the remarkable surgeon, and they were holding hands the way women who have been friends for 40 years hold hands in a waiting room. Not performatively, just steadily. My mother-in-law's husband was there. My husband's cousin, a woman I didn't recognize. And my husband, who was sitting in the corner looking at his phone, and who looked up when the door opened. The expressions moved across their faces in a sequence I have thought about many times since. My husband's was first, recognition, then something complicated and quiet, that I think was relief, mixed with something he'd have to sort out later. The others took a beat longer. My mother-in-law looked at me the way you look at something that doesn't fit the pattern your brain has already drawn. I was in scrubs. I had my hospital ID around my neck. I was holding the family's file in my hand. It took a second, not long, maybe 3 seconds, before whatever she was expecting to see gave way to what was actually in front of her. The surgery went well, I said. I was speaking to the room, but I was looking at the family, at her closest friend specifically, because she was the one who needed to hear it most. He came through without complications. The approach we used was technically demanding, but it gave us the best outcome possible. He'll be in recovery shortly and you'll be able to see him within the hour. Silence. My mother-in-law's closest friend had her hand pressed to her chest. She was crying in that immediate, involuntary way people cry when tension releases all at once. You. She started. She looked at me, then at my mother-in-law, then back at me. You're the surgeon? I am, I said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She stood up and crossed the room and took both of my hands in hers and held them, which I was not expecting. And she kept saying thank you in a way that made it clear she meant something larger than the word. I looked over her shoulder. My mother-in-law had not moved. She was still sitting in the same chair, her posture very straight, her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at me. Not through me, the way she sometimes looked at me during dinners. That particular gaze that registered my presence without quite seeing me. This was different. This was the look of someone who was doing a rapid, uncomfortable calculation. My husband came to stand beside me. He put his hand on my back. It was a quiet thing. He didn't say anything, he just stood there. My mother-in-law said, eventually, I didn't know you worked with cardiac cases. It was an extraordinary sentence. I had been a cardiothoracic surgeon for 3 years. It had come up, not once, but several times, in that circling way that information moves through families. She had simply never registered it, or she had registered it and filed it somewhere that wasn't connected to the category of impressive or remarkable or extraordinary. It's what I do, I said, gently, without sharpness. She nodded slowly. There was something on her face that I recognized after a moment, as embarrassment. Not the performative kind, the real kind, the kind that sits low and heavy and can't be talked away. I excused myself to complete my post-op notes. My husband walked with me into the hallway. We stood there for a moment, not quite looking at each other. She thought you were in administration, he said, finally. It was less a confession than a thing he needed to say out loud. I know, I said. She's told people that. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I should have said something. More clearly, more often. I thought she knew. She knew enough, I said. She just chose a version of me that was easier to hold on to. He nodded. He looked tired and young, the way people look when something they've managed not to see becomes undeniable. I didn't feel angry, standing there. That surprised me a little. I'd expected to feel something sharp, something with edges. Instead, I felt steady. Like I was standing on ground I'd been building for a long time without fully knowing it. The weeks after that were quiet in the way that important things are often quiet. Nothing dramatic happened. My mother-in-law didn't make a speech or write me a letter or arrive at our door with an apology she'd been rehearsing. Real life is not usually like that. What happened was smaller. She called my husband more than usual. She asked about me by name, and she asked specifically, not how's your wife but how is she doing? Is the schedule better this month? She must be exhausted. My husband told me this and I listened and didn't say much. She also apparently told her closest friend, who had been asking questions about the surgeon who'd operated on her husband, the whole story. Who I was, what my specialty was, how long I had been doing it. Her friend, who had spent years expressing admiration for a remarkable surgeon without knowing that surgeon was sitting across the dinner table from her, reportedly cried on the phone. I don't say this to be unkind about either of them. People sees what they expect to see. That is a human failure, not a personal one. I had been, in the story my mother-in-law told herself, a certain kind of person, present but peripheral, competent perhaps, but in an unremarkable way, Someone who'd married her son and worked somewhere at a hospital and didn't quite belong in the spaces she most valued. That story was easier for her than the alternative. Revising it required something she hadn't been prepared to do. I understood it, in the way that you understand a thing without excusing it. Her closest friend's husband recovered well. He was discharged after 8 days. At his follow-up 6 weeks later, he looked like a different man, color in his face, steadier on his feet, making his pasta again. He told me, in the examining room, that he hadn't wanted to bother anyone with how tired he'd been feeling for the past year, that he'd assumed it was just getting older, that he was sorry for not coming in sooner. I told him he wasn't bothering anyone, that he could come in whenever something felt wrong. That's what we were there for. He thanked me, and then, in the way of shy men who have decided to say something, he said, "My wife says you've been part of the family for years and she never knew. She feels terrible about that." "She doesn't need to," I said. "She knows now." There was a dinner in the spring. The kind of dinner my mother-in-law hosts at the long table with the good dishes and the fresh flowers on the entry table. The kind I had attended dozens of times, always slightly sideways to everything, never quite landing. I arrived with my husband. My mother-in-law met us at the door. She looked at me in a way that was different from before, not warmer, exactly, or not only that, more direct, like she was actually looking. "I'm glad you could come," she said. "I know your schedule makes it difficult." She said it simply, without the old tissue paper quality, like it was just true. "Thank you for having me," I said. We went inside. The table was full. Her closest friend was there, and she stood up when she saw me and hugged me the way she hadn't before, the way people hug you when they mean it, when the gesture is carrying something more than the gesture itself. At dinner, someone asked what I had been working on lately. It was a general question, the kind people ask at dinner tables, but it landed on me specifically, and the table went a little quiet. I talked for a few minutes about a technique we were refining for minimally invasive valve repair. Nothing too clinical, just enough to give the shape of it, the puzzle of it. I talked about why I found it interesting. I said that cardiac surgery was one of the few fields where the difficulty of the problem was exactly what drew you to it, that the cases no one else wanted were the ones that kept you sharp. My mother-in-law was listening. Not politely, the way she used to listen to things I said. Letting the sound reach her, without really taking it in. She was listening the way you listen when you realize you have been missing something. Afterward, in the kitchen, she and I were briefly alone while she looked for the serving spoon she'd misplaced. She found it in the wrong drawer and laughed at herself in a tired way. Then she said without looking at me, "I don't think I've been fair to you." I let that sit. "I made up my mind early," she said, "about who you were, and I didn't let it change." "I know," I said. "I'm not sure I can explain why." She was holding the spoon and looking at the counter. "I think it felt easier to have you be a certain kind of thing." She paused. "That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "it's not." She looked up then, her eyes were tired. She was 64 years old, and she had built a life around being certain, and certainty is a thing that's very comfortable until it isn't. "I'm sorry," she said. I didn't say it's fine, because it wasn't, not entirely, and she would have known I was being polite. I didn't say I forgive you, because forgiveness isn't something you produce on demand. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." And I meant it, without conditions. She nodded. She straightened up. She walked back toward the dining room, and after a moment, I followed her. I have thought a lot about what I wanted from her, all those years. I think for a long time what I wanted was very simple. I wanted her to see me. Not be impressed by me, not admire me, not feel proud, just see. Just let the person standing in front of her be the person standing in front of her, rather than the version she'd decided on before I'd said a word. That's a small thing to want. It's also, for some people, very difficult to give. She had spent years admiring a surgeon she'd never met, praising her to rooms full of people, speaking about her accomplishments with genuine warmth. That surgeon was abstract. Abstract people are easy to admire. They arrive without all the inconvenient specificity of an actual person. Without the small-town background and the hardware store parents and the way they hold their fork and the fact that they married your son and didn't grow up in a house like yours, I was too specific. Too real, too present at the table. What she didn't see, until she was sitting in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the afternoon, watching me walk through a door in scrubs, was that the specificities was the whole point. I didn't become a surgeon despite where I came from. I became one because of what I already was. Someone who had learned, early and practically and without much fuss, that hard things were just hard and then you did them anyway. My mother in Manitoba understood that. She understood it the way people understand things they've lived, Not the way you understand things you've been told. She didn't have a book club or a long table with good dishes. She had a hardware store and a daughter who asked a lot of questions and a belief, quiet and consistent, that the questions were worth us asking. I called her after the dinner in the spring. It was late in Manitoba, and she answered on the third ring, sounding not sleepy but careful, the way she always answered late calls. "Everything okay?" she said first. "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to call." We talked for almost an hour about nothing in particular. The store, the weather, a new family that had moved in down the road. She told me about a customer who had come in needing advice about a plumbing repair he'd been putting off for 2 years, and finally decided to tackle himself. She told me what she'd told him. She was proud of him for trying. Before we hung up, she said, "How's his family treating you?" She asked it carefully, which meant she'd been wondering for a while. "Better," I said. "It's getting better." She made a sound that meant she understood more than she was going to say. Then, "You know you never needed anything from them." "I know," I said. "You never did," she said. "You had everything before you walked through that door." I thought about that long after we hung up. I stood in the kitchen of the house I lived in the city I had chosen, in the life I had built, quietly without fanfare, 1 year at a time, and I let it settle. She was right. I had always had everything I needed. I had just spent a long time looking for permission to know it. I didn't need that permission anymore. I hadn't needed it for years, really. I had just been slow to stop asking.